Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. When you think of what happens when a player gets cut, 99.9% of the time, it goes something like this. They meet with a coaching staff in the front office, they hand in their playbook, they clean out their locker, they say goodbye to some people along the way, and then they disappear, never to be seen again. Now, there are some exceptions, like the time Los Angeles Rams wide receiver George Farmer stayed around the facility for hours after he got cut just because he had nowhere else to go. You can learn more about that absolutely bizarre situation from the 1980s by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But usually, all of these cuts are the same in terms of how the player exits the facility. You certainly don't expect anything like what happened in 1985 with the Cleveland Browns. This is wide receiver Ricky Feacher, and he spent close to a decade in the NFL with the Browns. As is the case with every player who plays in the league, Father Time is undefeated, and eventually, you have to hang it up and can't play forever. When Feacher got cut by the Browns, he did not leave the facility. When Feacher got cut by the Browns, it was not business as usual, and wasn't the traditional cut. Because what Feacher did when he got cut was completely unexpected, completely out of the ordinary, and completely abnormal that to this day, it's remembered as the classiest cut in the over 75-year history of the franchise. And this is the story behind the bizarre, yet great ending to Ricky Feacher's stint in Cleveland. Before I talk about Feacher getting cut by the Browns and what led to that decision, as well as what he did after getting cut that was so unexpected that it's the main focus of this story close to 40 years after the fact, we need some context to understand just who Ricky Feacher is. Our story begins in 1976, when the New England Patriots drafted the Mississippi Valley State wide receiver in the 10th round of the NFL Draft, making him the best and most famous wide receiver to ever get drafted out of Mississippi Valley State. Can't think of anyone else who did this. Anyways, just the fact that he was alive, let alone made it into the NFL, was remarkable by itself. When he was born in 1954, he was born with leukemia and was allergic to every food. Somehow, he overcame the odds and made it into the league. Sticking in the league was going to be another challenge, especially after the Patriots got rid of him after just 3 games, although he found a home with the Cleveland Browns. Feacher was mainly used as a backup over his first 5 seasons with the team. In 1976, he had no receptions. He had no receptions in 1977, 4 receptions in 1978, 7 receptions in 1979, and 10 receptions in 1980. However, to the surprise of maybe a lot of people, even though Feacher wasn't seeing the field a whole lot, he was surviving on the roster and was not getting cut. He was putting in the work during practice and was making himself a favorite of head coach Sam Rutigliano. And by 1981, all of that hard work paid off, as in his 6th season, for the first time in his career, he would be a starter for multiple games. And by 1982, following the departure of Reggie Rucker, who played 7 seasons in Cleveland and was one of the best receivers in franchise history at the time, Feacher was a full-time starter. As a side note, if you want to learn more about the career of Reggie Rucker, click the card in the upper right corner. Throughout the first half of the 1980s, Feacher was an instrumental part of Cleveland's offense, and in 1982, during the strike-shortened season, he started all 9 games and finished tied for the team lead in receiving touchdowns, alongside eventual Hall of Fame tight end Ozzie Newsome. Not bad company to be in. His strong play, along with a terrible playoff format that allowed more than half of the league in, was a big reason why the Browns made it into the postseason. And even though the Browns lost in the first round 27-10 to the Los Angeles Raiders, you could not blame Feacher for the loss, as he scored the only touchdown of the game for the Browns, and led the team with 4 receptions and 124 yards. In fact, you could argue that he had the greatest game by any receiver in Browns history in the postseason, as at the time, only one player in franchise history had a receiving touchdown, 124 yards receiving, and 30 yards per reception in a playoff game. That was Ricky Feacher himself. Over the first half of the 1980s, his numbers were fairly consistent on a year-to-year basis. In that 5-year stretch, he had 102 receptions for 1,905 yards and 14 touchdowns. While those numbers are not great by any means, he was an incredibly solid role player, and at the time that the 1984 season ended, he had 113 career receptions for 2,084 yards and 15 touchdowns. For some perspective, the man was a 10th round pick. In the 1976 NFL Draft, 16 of the 28 players taken never even played a snap in the NFL. And this man played roughly a decade, and did so with a team that didn't even take him. And there were quite a few big touchdowns in there. He had 2 touchdowns in the second half of a 1980 regular season finale against the Cincinnati Bengals to give Cleveland a come-from-behind 27-24 victory and help them win the AFC Central for the first time since 1971. You can learn more about the crazy ending to that 1980 season by clicking the card in the upper right corner. He scored the game-winning touchdown, and the only touchdown for the Browns for that matter, in the fourth quarter of their 1982 game against the New England Patriots to give Cleveland a 10-7 win. That was the first game played after the 2-month-long strike. And there was his great performance against the Houston Oilers in 1982 that got the Browns into the playoffs, where Cleveland won 20-14 and Feacher led the team in receptions. Feacher was a solid player who knew his role, and was somewhat of a fan favorite for just how long he stuck around, especially after his great 1980 performance against the Bengals for the division title. But entering the 1985 season, the writing seemed to be on the wall, because in 1985, the Cleveland Browns were under new management. This is Marty Schottenheimer. Today, he's remembered as one of the greatest coaches in NFL history, and maybe the greatest coach in the Super Bowl era to never make it to the big game. But back in 1985, he was just starting out. Schottenheimer took over the Browns in 1984 after a disastrous 1-7 start by Sam Rutigliano. And under Schottenheimer, the Browns somewhat rebounded, going 4-4 the rest of the way. Because of Schottenheimer's strong interim stint where he took one of the worst teams in football to a 500 ball club over the second half, he was named the full-time head coach, making 1985 his first permanent season in charge of the organization. As a side note, if you want to learn more about Schottenheimer and his time with the Cleveland Browns, especially that first full season of his from 1985, click the card in the upper right corner. Feacher wasn't utilized a whole lot in 1984 by Schottenheimer, and his production declined over the second half of the season. Whereas he had one game without a catch in the first half of the season, he had 4 such games in the second half. Whereas he had 13 receptions in the first half of the season, he had 9 in the second half. And whereas he had 217 receiving yards in the first half of the season, he had 165 in the second half. I should note that over the first 5 games of Schottenheimer's tenure, Feacher, despite being active for every game, made just 1 reception, which was a 16-yard catch in a 23-7 victory on the road against the Atlanta Falcons. It was very clear that Feacher was being phased out of the offense. And if that wasn't clear enough during the season, it was especially clear in the offseason, because the emphasis for the Browns in the 1985 NFL Draft was a youth movement at the wide receiver position. After having a lethargic receiving unit in 1984 that helped guide the Browns to a passing offense that finished in the bottom half of the league, just about every wideout not named Brian Brennan was put on notice. That year, in the 12-round NFL Draft consisting of 336 picks, the Browns only had 7 picks. Yet despite their relatively low ammo, they went all in on receiver, heavily investing at the position. They spent one of their picks on Elizabeth City State wide receiver Reggie Langhorne, who played 7 seasons with the Browns, started 81 games, and had over 3,500 yards with the team, making him a really solid choice for a 7th rounder. They spent one of their picks on Liberty wide receiver Fred Banks, who would eventually become known for his time with the Miami Dolphins. And they spent one of their picks on Nebraska wide receiver Shane Swanson, who never wound up playing a snap for the team. Regardless, when you're already seeing a reduction in playing time, and your team drafts 3 receivers when they only have 7 picks to work with, spending roughly half of their ammunition on one position, you know you're in trouble. It wasn't too shocking that training camp in 1985 would be the last one that Feacher spent with the Browns. What was shocking, however, was what happened afterwards. Ricky Feacher overcame so many obstacles in his life, and time again beat the odds. I don't think a single person thought that this man would still be in the NFL by 1985. Heck, if you knew him when he was a kid, you probably didn't think he'd even be alive in 1985. Yet time and time again, he defied everyone in all the predictions, and kept making it onto the roster and surviving final cuts. Feacher was on the bubble practically every year to start his career off, and every time, he survived, with his bubble failing to burst. However, in 1985, his luck finally ran out, because on Monday, August 12, 1985, Ricky Feacher's near-decade-long tenure with the Browns came to an end, when to the surprise of very few people, if anyone, Marty Schottenheimer decided to let the veteran go. It was the end of the road after quite the career. After this day, he would never step into the Browns facility as a player again. So let's think of what a player would usually do in this situation, where they get cut by a team. Again, as I said at the top of the video, they'll say goodbye to some people and clean out their locker. Maybe in the case of a guy like Feacher, he'll stay around a little bit longer just to soak it all in one more time, and because he might have to say goodbye to a few more people, having been there for nearly a decade. But Feacher did something remarkable after finding out the news that he got cut. Because Feacher didn't leave right away or after saying goodbyes. He wanted to make sure that even though he wasn't going to be in Cleveland anymore, that the players were going to be in a good spot. When Feacher got cut, one of his first orders of business was going around the facility and rounding up all of the receivers. These were the same guys that beat him out for a spot on the roster. And when Feacher rounded all of those guys up, he began to coach them, give them advice, talk about the whole process, and wish them luck. Remember that this was a younger squad at the receiver position, and a lot of these guys had not been through the process before. Feacher wanted to make sure that everyone was in the best possible position. As Feacher said, "I have a lot of respect for other players. I know what these younger guys, first and second year men, are feeling right now. There are many things going on in their minds that doesn't concern playing performance. I was in that position once. I know what it's like to be fighting your heart out. There's 85 guys in camp right now, and only 45 make the team. So I told them not to worry. I gave them a vote of confidence from a guy who has been around the league for 9 years. I wanted to give them some incentive to make it. I told them to go out there and keep sawing wood." Again, these were the guys that beat him out for the job, and maybe ended his career in the NFL, as Feacher didn't sound at the time like he was ready to retire, saying that he had no doubts that he could still play. These were the same guys that took his livelihood from him. And here he was, even though he wasn't a member of the team anymore, giving them advice, coaching them up, and telling them everything was going to be okay. Feacher could not have possibly handled this situation with more class if he tried. Feacher re-emphasized after meeting with reporters that he was not bitter about the situation, and that he understood that it was time to make a change. If anything, he sounded grateful for the opportunity just to be with this fine organization for nearly a decade, and to end his time in Cleveland third all-time in yards per reception, only behind team legends Ray Renfro and Paul Warfield. Even public relations director Kevin Byrne was impressed with the way he departed, saying he has been one of the team's leaders over the last few years. But still, imagine doing what he did at what must be a traumatic time for anyone. Feacher just lost his job, and yet was going out as gracious as possible, encouraging, supporting, and teaching the men who beat him out, congratulating them along the way. And as it turns out, this would be his final impression in the NFL. While Feacher said that he felt he could play another year, and said that he wanted to retire in Cleveland, he said that he was hoping that getting cut by the Browns would result in a short waiting period, and hoped that one of the other 27 teams in the National Football League would give the now 31-year-old receiver a look as he tried to embark on Chapter 3 of his career, following a very short Chapter 1 in New England and a lengthy Chapter 2 in Cleveland. However, even though he was in contact with other teams, including the possibility of working in the front office with the Browns, nothing ever materialized. And 2 weeks after the announcement, Feacher announced his retirement from the NFL, beginning his new career as an owner of Adam's Rib Restaurant in Cleveland. Just like that, his NFL career was over. The Browns would have lots of success after Feacher left. They made it to the postseason and won the AFC Central in that first season, and Schottenheimer's vision paid off, as throughout the second half of the 1980s, the Browns were one of the best teams in the AFC, and were formidable contenders every year. All Feacher could do was watch as the young guys he spoke to afterwards, like Brian Brennan, Clarence Weathers, and Reggie Langhorne, had success and led the team to their best and most prominent period in the Super Bowl era. But considering how he felt after getting cut, I think he was more than okay with that. If his words and his advice resonated with even one player on the team, then that was good enough for him, even though he was no longer a Cleveland Brown via roster designation. Today, Ricky Feacher is somewhat of a forgotten player lost in history amongst everyone but the die-hard Browns fans who were around at the time and remember his contributions from the first half of the 1980s as a solid role player. But in reality, Ricky Feacher should be remembered today not necessarily for what he did on the field, but for how he left the field. If you want to talk about a man who was gracious in defeat, and if you want to talk about a man who knew that a man's true impact is in leaving something in a better position than how he found it, then Ricky Feacher is the prime example of that. Because the ending to Ricky Feacher's career was, considering the circumstances, nothing short of remarkable. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.